Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I've worked for a long time with IRIC here at Queen Margaret, even although I'm not employed by the university. But I'm very happy to support this event on this significant occasion in the midst of the hell that Maria has already spoken about. And I just want to give a little bit of the historical context to the circumstances that we're in now. And I'm starting with this picture. This is 100 years ago, 1925, on the slopes of Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, above the Mount of Olives. And there are thousands of people who were gathered here on this day. And they were here to inaugurate the new Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And this man here, Arthur Balfour of East Lothian, was their revered guest of honour. He was a man that belonged to the British aristocracy. He came from generations of Conservative politicians, including his uncle Lord Salisbury, who had been the Prime Minister. He himself was the Prime Minister around the turn of the century, and he was the Foreign Secretary at the time of the Balfour Declaration. So he had all the kind of land, wealth, privilege, assumptions of the right to rule. He belonged very firmly to the British ruling class in an age of empire. And although most of his life and career was in England, his Scottish connections were significant, in particular his mother, and from her he kind of absorbed the evangelical, restorationist Christian perspective, Christian beliefs that really made him very open and susceptible to the ideology and the claims of the Zionist project. In 1925, as Maria has said, Palestine was under the British control as a mandate of the League of Nations. After the First World War, at a time of rising national sentiment and anti-colonial sentiment and aspirations, these mandates were ostensibly meant to facilitate progress to self-determination and statehood among the people who were living in the territories of the collapsed and defeated empires of the war. The victorious empires, the British and French empires, during the war, had armed an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which was in British and French interests, and promised that in return that they would support the independence of Arab states after the war and after the settlement. But British diplomacy was always about self-interest and about the geopolitics, and particularly securing the strategic interests to maintain and sustain the British Empire beyond the time of the war. And as Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour here made a contradictory pledge to the ethno-cultural Zionist project which had emerged in the 19th century, arguing that the Jewish people constituted a nation with historical claims to a homeland. And they had set although they had considered other options, including Uganda, they had set their sights on Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was a very short statement. It went through many drafts. Balfour himself was not the only writer of this. It had been thought very carefully. The language is vague, it's purposely and deliberately vague. And this is really the influence of particularly Chaim Weizmann, who had galvanized the Zionist movement into kind of driving this claim for Palestine. And he had persuaded Balfour and Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, that the Zionist movement and world Jewry were synonymous, that one is another way of saying the other, and that not only that, but they aligned very clearly with British interests in the Middle East. And so he encouraged them to support this plan of mass-scale, large-scale immigration to create a settler colony of European occupation, kind of in the model of the white dominions of the British Empire, like Canada, like Australia, which had similarly settled territories and had repressed and done all that they could to eliminate the indigenous populations and peoples. South Africa was another good example of this. So this text, there are two things really particularly to note about it. One is that it completely effaces Palestinian identity. It talks about the non-Jewish peoples and the rights of the non-Jewish peoples in the land. This, as a Scottish critic said, was kind of like if during the time of mass immigration from Ireland into Scotland, the Scots had been referred to as the non-Irish population and had had their rights and their land dispossessed. And the other thing to note is that it says that the aim is a national Jewish homeland, which is very carefully constructed wording to avoid the notion that what was intended was a state, a Jewish state, a Zionist state, a colonial state of Jewish people whose political rights would efface the rights of any other people living in Palestine. And that was really, in fact, what the mandate and what the declaration set out and encouraged to be developed and facilitated under cover of the British political and military protection of the mandate. In fact, this would not have become a legal document if it hadn't been for the machinations of Balfour and of the inner circle, particularly including Weizmann, with no Arab consultation, no Arab involvement, no Palestinian voices being heard. It was incorporated into the terms of the mandate. This wasn't, universally accepted. It was highly contested, although eventually, prevailed and became the dominant narrative. Here's somebody from the United Free Church of Scotland in 1917 expressing a critique of the Balfour Declaration, noting that that Jews are scattered, they're diverse in language and civilization, that there's no widespread enthusiasm for the Zionist idea, that Palestine had not been the home of the great majority of Jews, and that, and most importantly, that the land of Palestine is owned and cultivated by Arabs. It was not a land without people for a people without land. There was Jewish objection too. The only Jewish member of the cabinet opposed the Balfour Declaration. Lord Curzon was a constant protester about it, pointing out, that the mandate was going to be used based on these kind of ideals of self-determination, and then drawing up a document which is an avowed constitution for a Jewish state. This is the mandate, and it's a kind of carve up between French and British interests, really. So the French mandate was what had been kind of northern Palestine, Syria, and there. And this is the British mandate with Palestine and what was known then as Transjordan. And you see here the dotted line marks the boundary of what was claimed for the Jewish national home. So by 1925, when Balfour arrived for his visit to Palestine, and here he is with Weizmann and other of these dignitaries, the project was already well underway. There had already been significant Jewish immigration into Palestine, and there was about 70,000 Jews, I think, in Palestine by this time. And the main methods of settlement, of occupation, where land dispossession, mass immigration, and force, the British Army of occupation were there to impose and to force and to encourage the Jewish incomers. And also the kind of establishment of cultural and educational institutions, which is why the Hebrew University was seen as so significant. And it was named Hebrew quite deliberately because it was to be taught in the Hebrew language, which had been a dead liturgical language, which was being revived. A counter-proposal that it should be a multilingual teaching establishment, including Arabic, was rejected. So here he is. And during his time, during his visit, there was huge security because the hostility and resentment of the Palestinian people, of the Arab, Christian, Muslim populations was fierce and was going to be expressed somehow. And they had been encouraged very forcibly that a more dignified form of protest would be the non-violent protest. So the kinds of resistance and protest that the Arab Executive Committee, who were kind of the representative organization and voice for Palestinians, they draped their building in black. People wore colours of mourning. As Maria has already said, there was a general strike on the 24th, which was the day that Balfour was travelling from Egypt into Palestine. All the shops were closed. The streets of Jerusalem were deserted. This made an impact, but not really on Balfour, because he was willfully ignorant of all of this and was protected by the High Commissioner and all the British officials, and certainly by the military, who, by the way, were not that enamoured of the whole kind of Zionist project in Palestine. The main Arab newspaper that had sustained a consistent critique of Balfour produced a special English language edition for that day. And it's a very extensive, this is what's wrong. This is why we, the people of Palestine, think that this project is a catastrophe and it's going to lead to disaster for all of us. But none of this really touched Balfour, who was, cocooned away from all of this during his visit, where he just met with cheering crowds and people who were in favour. Until he got to Syria, until he crossed the border out of British protection. And then he really saw the weight and the force of the resistance and protest against the declaration and against the Zionist project. Outside his hotel, there was a demonstration of thousands. Stones were thrown at the hotel. There were riots in the streets. The outrage, the resentment, the bitterness, the hostility to what he had set in motion with the declaration became very evident, and he had to get quickly shifted out of Syria and onto his boat and away. Not that affected his views. In fact, he came back saying, "I'm even more sanguine about the wisdom and the possibilities of this great project." People prayed and tried to get their voices heard. They prayed at the Dome of the Rock, Christians and Muslims together. All of this was reported in the press in Britain and elsewhere. And although the majority kind of story that was told was a very positive one about this great new movement and of this wonderful new white European colony that was being established in Palestine, there were those who problematized and troubled this rosy picture. The Birmingham Post, for example, commented, "One has to recognise that material fears are not the only nor even the most prolific source of trouble. Behind Arab fears of exploitation lies a larger and vaguer fear that Palestine in a few generations will be in essentials a Jewish country and its Arab inhabitants no more than an inferior class." in prescient words. So I just want to close with this memorial plaque to Alfred Balfour in his ancestral home along the road there in the church. This plaque reads, "To the glory of God and in remembrance, who by his great gifts of heart and mind, statesman and philosopher, enriched the realms of thought and prayer and advanced truth and righteousness and peace in the world." One has to ask, what kind of peace did this man advance? He was there 100 years ago at the establishment of a new institution of higher learning. And this is what's happened to the universities and educational institutions of Gaza this year. Over to Eileen.
Okay, I'm going to just very briefly talk about teaching Palestine, really on the basis of having taught about Palestine in various occasions here and elsewhere. And I just thought I'd start with say, well, teaching Palestine, what's the problem? Why would we want to have a particular session on teaching Palestine? Well, several problematics, if you like. First of all, the dominant narratives. We're used to the Israeli propaganda being the dominant narrative in a lot of media sources. It's a very powerful country. It's got a very sophisticated propaganda machine, both directly and also through proxies, committed Zionist organizations across the world. So there is the backdrop of, and whenever we talk about education, education is always a selection from the potential narratives and knowledge that exists in society. And the Israeli propaganda forms, I feel like, a backdrop for that. There are particular narratives that actually almost seem to be seductive. The conflict narrative, that what we're talking about is a conflict between two equal peoples, two ethnic groups claiming for the same piece of land. That is also another dominant narrative where the demand therefore is to say, well, if you're teaching it, you can't take sides. You have to have a balanced approach. So these are the kind of dominant narratives around. And also we've seen more recently, perhaps a slightly newer narrative, which is a humanitarian narrative. So again, the mainstream media, rather than actually opposing the Israeli propaganda with a Palestinian resistance narrative, what they tend to do is to oppose it with a humanitarian narrative. The Palestinian voice tends to be, or the Palestinian voice of resistance tends to be absent. So that's one of the problems of teaching Palestine. There's also a fear of reaction. As a colleague of mine said, admitted that he didn't bring up Israel-Palestine in his classes because of his own academic cowardice. Yeah, he was afraid of what that. So we found other ways to teach about whatever it was he wanted to talk about. The other fear of reaction is fear of getting into trouble, and that's a very real fear. Yeah, there are groups who will mobilize and complain about teachers, academics who are teaching about Palestine. And I've had to support people in other institutions who have had complaints against them, and the university has investigated these complaints and all the rest of it. So there is a fear of getting into trouble, and sometimes that trouble can be, even more serious than a complaint in a university or in a classroom. The police and the legal systems quite often take a muddled view of what it is to teach about Palestinian resistance to Zionist colonialism, and the kind of the terrorism laws in this country are a real tool for trying to silence any kind of view of Palestinian resistance. And as we've seen from Leslie's talk, Palestinian resistance has been constant and ongoing ever since the Zionist project started. Sometimes it's taken violent forms. Most of the time, it's taken non-violent forms. But it's been a constant. So the terrorism legislations make things like more complicated because there's a chilling effect of saying, oh, we can't talk about Palestinian resistance. The other thing that we've heard from colleagues is that I don't know enough about it. It's a complex problem. I don't know enough, so I better not say anything because I'll get myself into deep water. And I think, you know, there is a complexity to it, as there is to anything, but usually that doesn't prevent academics talking about complex things that they know nothing about. No, I didn't say that. But the complexity or the claim that it's complex is often used to try and intimidate or to frighten people. So what I want to talk about is, you know, if you were teaching anything else, you would try and make it relevant. You would try and contextualize it. You would try and provide an analysis. And I think that the same applies here. And by doing that, it actually makes teaching Palestine a bit easier to overcome some of these reactions to it. And the phrase, and both Maria and Leslie have used the phrase settler colonization, I think is an absolutely important analytical framework in which to teach Palestine. Because what you're talking about is the colonization of a land by another people, primarily from Europe or of European heritage, to, as Patrick Wolf says, annihilate the native, to remove the native, to displace the indigenous population with a new population, just as happened in what is now United States of America, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on. So what you're talking about is a geopolitical phenomenon. You're not talking about Jews, yeah. So the muddle of being accused of being anti-Semitic by calling it a colonial project is removed, because any more than saying that the convicts that were deported to Australia, and some of whom stayed there, was anti-convict. It's not anti-convict. It's just that it's talking about a phenomenon that the dominant powers have been able to impose on colonies. And of course, settler colonization is different from the kind of classical colonization where there is a mother state which is absorbing the kind of value from the colonized, both the resources and the labor power. In a settler colonial state, the labor power is really unimportant. You want to get rid of the indigenous population and replace it with the settled population. So it's a very useful analytical tool, and each settler colony is slightly different, inevitably, but as a model, it's a very useful way of teaching about it. And I want to give as a case study what I quite often draw on when I'm teaching, which is the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. Now, again, because it's got Jewish in the title, people are a little bit back off, so we better not talk about that. It sounds like we're being critical of something that's Jewish, and that might be anti-Semitic. But actually, telling the story of the Jewish National Fund, I think, is a really valuable way of explaining how the distinction between Zionism and Judaism. So we've seen some of the history of it. You know, setting it in the context of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine's location within it, British involvement, and I'm not going to go through this because Leslie's covered that note, but a bit of historical context is always very useful in terms of teaching about Palestine. Pictures of maps is always very useful. The shape of the British mandate, or the bit of Palestine that was a British mandate, I've taken the Transjordan bit not there. And then saying where we are now, from since 1948, Israel, the state of Israel was imposed on the vast majority of Palestine. What became known as the occupied Palestinian territories from 1967, with the occupation, where the West Bank was taken from Jordan and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and then with the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, where within the occupied Palestinian territory, different categories of land were were designated area A, B, and C. So the vast majority, this is the West Bank, the vast majority of area C, of the West Bank is area C, which is under the entire military and civil control of Israel. The Palestinian Authority is in theory in control in area A, both in terms of security and civilian rule, but only with the approval of the Israeli authorities. So in other words, the geography of current day Palestine is just pictorially, it tells the story of the history. And of course, the Gaza Strip was under a blockade since 2007 when Hamas was elected in the Palestinian Authority elections, or Palestinian legislature elections. And of course, we're now familiar with what the situation is in Gaza because it's on our screens. The Jewish National Fund is a very useful model to draw on. Jewish National Fund was established in 1901 in Britain by the World Zionist Organization. The World Zionist Organization that was formed in the end of the 19th century with, as a lot of parts of Europe and across the world were developing nationalisms in the 19th century. And the World Zionist Organization was established under this argument that the Jewish population constitute a nation and therefore are entitled to their own nationalism and therefore their own state. And as Leslie said, there were arguments about where that state should be, but it was settled on Palestine. So the Jewish National Fund was about establishing the Jewish nation. It wasn't about just a Jewish fund, and it was one of the institutions set up by the World Zionist Organization. There were political organizations, the Jewish Agency, there was labor organizations, the Histadrut, and there was a land development or land acquisition and development agency, which was the Jewish National Fund, which was expressly for the colonization of Palestine. These were in the days where it was less embarrassing to say that you were in favor of colonization. So it was very explicit. We're setting this up in order to colonize Palestine. And see, these are some of the early pictures of the organization about very very clearly it's redeeming the land, creating the Jewish homeland, etc. Youth settlement in Palestine, etc. Quite muscular imagery there about the JNF, and portraying the JNF as being an agency for development of land. I quite like this picture because the JNF now still exists. It portrays itself as an environmental organization, and so the imagery like that, where you've got explosions going on, and you've got what you call them, roads being cut through the wilderness and so on, contradict the kind of imagery that they now use in their propaganda. The reason why it's important to look at the JNF, I think, is because there are particular instances where Palestinians have been expelled from land, and the Jewish National Fund has taken the control of the land and prevented Palestinian return. In the early days of the mandate, the JNF was buying land from absentee landowners primarily, and only managed to obtain a fairly small amount of land. In 1948, with the expulsion of 450,000 Palestinians from their homes and destruction of the villages, what's known as the Nakba, the Jewish National Fund became the custodian of the land that the military had taken from the Palestinians. And if you go to the State of Israel today, you can see Jewish National Fund lands where the remains of Palestinian villages continue to be. This is the JNF land called British Park. It's called British Park because funds have been raised from British branch of the JNF to really to put up picnic tables and things like that. So it's and this wall, if you know where to look, this wall is the remains of a house from the village of Ajar. Ajar was a Palestinian village. It was depopulated in 1948, and it was ultimately destroyed. And then the JNF built a park on the front. That doesn't look like much of a park here. There's pretty a bit. So it tells the story of 1948, of the Nakba. This is what the Jewish National Fund has been about. 1967, with the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, also the JNF took control of other bits of land, which has now been sequestered into the state of Israel. And this is in Canada Park. This is because the funds were raised in the Canadian JNF. And this is the remains of the village of Imwas. It's supposed to be the same village that occurs in the Bible called Emmaus. Imwas was a Palestinian village, and the way in which that house has collapsed demonstrates that it was an explosion inside the house. It wasn't bulldozed or whatever; it was blown up. And this was in 1967. I was in the state of Israel in 2010 and witnessed the ongoing destruction by the JNF or by agents on behalf of the JNF in the Nachab, the Negev, the village of Al Arakib, which is a Bedouin village, which was being constantly destroyed, and every time it was destroyed, the population of the village would come back and build tents and so on. So I think when I was there, it had been destroyed about 5 or 6 times. It's now well over 100 times it's been destroyed, and people keep coming back. But this is still part of the JNF, so it's a story to tell about what's happening. What is happening now is an ongoing process of settler colonization throughout the world. Just to finish on this bit of the JNF has offices throughout the world, and it has at JNF Scotland. It uses the initials KKL, which is an anglicization of the Hebrew version of the name. So JNF KKL Scotland, and through Freedom of Information, managed to get some information about what they were raising funds for. And what they were raising funds for is £70,000 total to remitted to KKL Israel for the construction of the Gazit Reservoir situated in the north of the country. So a reservoir in the Gazit, in the kibbutz Gazit. So I managed to get an opportunity to go and visit kibbutz Gazit in the Galilee, and these are some pictures of the reservoir. Essentially, this is supposed to be an environmental improvement. The JNF Scotland is a registered charity on the grounds of making environmental improvements. Essentially, it's a body of water that's being used entirely for irrigating cash crops for the kibbutz. And you can see the remains of some stones there. Now, I can't guarantee that those are the stones from the Palestinian village, but it is true that Gazit kibbutz was built on the lands of Atira, the Palestinian village of Atira. And we've got documentary evidence that the population of Atira was expelled explicitly at the demand of Yosef Weitz. Yosef Weitz was one of the leading people in the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, at the time. So there's a direct link between the JNF and the Haganah, the military, the Zionist militias that were doing the expelling. Direct link between the JNF, the expulsion of Palestinians, and the JNF as an environmental charity in Scotland raising money for the reservoir there. making it relevant, making it connect with what's going on now and at home, I think is an important part of how you can teach Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris and Leslie. And hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So as I was born and raised in Palestine, I'd like to reflect more on the double consciousness of how I understand the role of education as a Palestinian and how the reality looks like or contradicts my understanding of education and its role in a context of injustice like the Palestinian context in this country at QMU and other universities in the UK. So I'd like to start talking about education and solidarity by first recalling my experience of studying in Palestine and what education means to the Palestinians. I did my undergraduate degree in English, language and literature at Birzeit University, which is located near Ramallah to the north of Jerusalem. Birzeit University was founded in 1972, 5 years after Israel occupied the West Bank. And it has been a place to envision an alternative and a more emancipatory version of the Palestinian society, characterized by the unification of the political struggle for liberation with a social class struggle. Birzeit University succeeded in cultivating a reputation among the Palestinian society as a hub to raise its students' political awareness. And the active role of its students in the anti-colonial movement led the Israeli authorities to close the university several times, most remarkable of which was the closure of 1987 for 4 months during the first Intifada. And the university responded to the closure by introducing an underground and an alternative system of education where classes were held at homes and in other rented places. And this picture was taken during that period while the university was forced to close, and the students and their teacher decided to hold the class outside, as you can see. And this is something that is being replicated now in the Gaza Strip, because Israel destroyed all the universities in Gaza, but people still insist on getting education. And this tells us that education is not about the physical infrastructure of universities and schools, and that Palestinians are showing that education is about communities of resistance, or universities are communities of resistance coming together to challenge the reality that they are going through. So during that period, education took on a different meaning as a revolutionary act to defy Israeli attempts to shrink Palestinian spaces as a measure of collective punishment. And although the political scene changed a lot since the first Intifada, when I was an undergraduate student there, Birzeit University continued to be a space to create and grow the Palestinian movement against Israeli colonial and apartheid policies, intertwined with a social struggle within the Palestinian society itself. And it was there at Birzeit University where I was first exposed to the revolutionary anti-colonial theories of Frantz Fanon, Ghassan Kanafani, Mahdi Amel, George Habash, Amilcar Cabral, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Aimé Césaire, among many others. And Birzeit University offers its students intensive courses on the history of Palestine and the history of Jerusalem, and also a compulsory course called The Question of Palestine. And while transferring down that knowledge to us, our professors never treated us as passive recipients of knowledge. Rather, they would share that knowledge with us as part of a problem-posing approach, focusing more on how to turn it into action on the ground. And outside the classroom, our teachers would join us in protests, in sit-ins, and other actions we used to hold, in solidarity with Palestinian political prisoners, carrying out hunger strikes in Israeli jails and against other repressive Israeli policies. Outside the classroom, our teachers were our comrades. I'm grateful to my teachers at Birzeit University because they treated me and my colleagues as organic intellectuals and as agents of change. They believed in our criticality and in our ability to act upon our reality, and saw in us a potential for a better, more just future for Palestine. They taught us that useful education is that which implicates us in the reality with our people and make us always in solidarity and even sacrifice and be at rest for our people. Indeed, they equip us with the needed skills and tools to survive and persevere in spite and because of Israeli settler colonial elimination, rather than with the skills to fit into the neoliberal market. I moved to Scotland to pursue further studies, first by doing a master's degree in English Literary Studies at Aberdeen University, and now as a PhD student at QMU, while bearing in mind this model of what role academia should be playing. However, I encountered a different reality here. As they are becoming more neoliberal, universities in this country uphold a discourse of neutrality. We are neutral and cannot take a political stance, they say. At the same time, they never stop talking about social justice and decolonization. When the genocide in Gaza started in 2023, decolonization and social justice appeared to be merely buzzwords and beautiful metaphors that cannot be enacted to end the academic institutions' direct and indirect complicity with Israeli oppression by adopting the Palestinian call for academic and cultural boycott of Israel. As Palestinian activist and scholar Rafif Ziadeh puts it in a recent article critiquing the silence of universities in the UK and beyond over Israel's genocide in Gaza, where she says, in presenting themselves as neutral arbiters, universities claim to be inclusive and to recognize all voices equally. However, this purported neutrality is embedded within a system of recognition that selectively validates certain narratives, those that align with the dominant political and ideological order, while marginalizing others, particularly those challenging the status quo. It is this narrative of neutrality and selectivity of whose story is worth a space in the mainstream narrative that outlaws and decriminalizes the pro-Palestine solidarity movement. These neutral universities have been recently colluding with the police to suppress Palestine solidarity actions on campus, as what happened in the latest case of the arrest of Mahmoud Khalid, the Palestinian student at Columbia University, who continues to be held in custody in dire conditions while facing deportation from the United States. His punishment is part of a systematic crackdown on Palestine solidarity activists that includes arrests, expulsion, detention, self-deportation, and degree revocations. But the increasing attempts to clamp down on the Palestine solidarity movement, including teachers who bravely break the walls of silence and teach about Palestine, is a testament to its growing importance and effectiveness in supporting the Palestinian struggle for liberation. The students' encampments are part of the legacy of the global student movement that once supported the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the civil rights movement, and the movement against the American war in Vietnam, among many other struggles. And for decades, Palestinians have been trying to educate the world about their suffering, and of course, our resistance, to recognize the Nakba and do justice to our struggle. But many turned a deaf ear to our voices, where the imperial violence that led to Israel's establishment continued to be hidden from students, including the partnership between the Zionist movement and Britain, which Leslie talked about, which was articulated in the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which, while promising the land of Palestine as the national home for the Jewish people, it buried more than 90% of the Palestinians with the term non-Jewish communities. But the tide is turning in favor of the Palestinians. It is true, Israel's genocidal war in Gaza continues to brutally slaughter Palestinians at a scale unprecedented, while turning their homes and educational institutions into rubble. But it has caused a rupture in the silence about Palestine. Both educators and students need to seize this moment of rupture and build on its momentum by including Palestine as a core subject in the curriculum. To deny the students the right to learn about injustices happening across the world like Palestine is to deny them the capacity to learn, to grow, and to be problem posers who are capable of making a difference in this world. Ignoring Palestine in process of learning is also grounded in a belief of hopelessness that gets instilled in the students. For Palestine represents the hope that our world desperately needs. It is a country that is being turned into ruins, while its people in their beautiful sumud, their steadfastness, refuse to be obliterated from history. With the rise of the right wing, the shrinking of democratic spaces, and the solidification of neoliberalism in the global north. To teach and learn about Palestine is not only an act of solidarity with the Palestinians, but an act of hope and an outlook to the future that the younger generation in this country need to be able to transform their reality. With this in mind, I'd like to end my speech with an excerpt from a statement issued by the Union of Professors and Employees at Pearson University last month in response to Trump's racist statement to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza and turn it into a seaside resort. I here quote them saying, "We want to take this opportunity to teach. We know, as our allies do, that our self-determination represents the future, one where the likes of Trump are mere footnotes in the history of how Palestine led the world in getting free." Thanks a lot. Sorry.